All right, I think we can get started. So good morning, everyone. My name is Holly Byker. I work out of the Ontario Crops Research Centre in Winchester, and I'm the agronomy manager for the Eastern and Northern Research Stations, so New Lisker, Emo, and Winchester. And Dr. Peter Sikkema is also here. He's going to be giving a talk this afternoon on control of fleabane, Canada fleabane, and water hemp. So I'm going to talk a little bit about herbicides and just like scouting our fields and preparing for next year for herbicide programs, and then also about some showing some water hemp and fleabane. But Peter's presentation this afternoon will kind of really go in depth about all of the control, and so I'm going to leave that to him. All right. So yeah, I guess what I do find about this time of year that's kind of perfect is that we kind of can take the time to scout and see what weeds are still have escaped our weed control throughout the season. So I guess my first question to you guys is what kind of weeds have you seen escape quite a bit this year and have been kind of a concern? Maybe you had to do your second pass for them, etc. Yes, Dad? Pigweed. Pigweed, yeah, lots of pigweed. Any other? No? Yeah, I feel like I've seen a lot of pigweed this year, a lot of grass escapes. A lot of the other groups said lamb's quarters. I feel like lamb's quarters is just a pain in general sometimes to work through, especially when we have hot summers. And yeah, I feel like those were kind of the main ones. Tend to be some ragweed as well escapes, but usually in spots where we might expect it in IP soybean fields, etc., where it's pretty common. So I guess looking at that and looking at this time of year, then I think what really makes sense is being able to know what weeds you have, and then kind of reflect back on what herbicides you sprayed, and did you expect them to control that? And if they didn't, maybe why didn't they control it? So we did have a pretty good wet, kind of up and down wet start to the season, and then we kind of hit a date where we didn't get very much rain afterwards. So were some of those herbicides maybe applied during that time and they didn't get rainfall? I know on the research station too, there's ranges that I sprayed in nice timing right before a rain. Weed control was great. I didn't have to do a second pass. There's other ones that I've had to spray a few times just because the timing the plants also took a little time to get to row closure. I know at home as well, where we saw those pigweed escapes or those grasses were kind of in areas where we do no-till beans. The beans maybe near the field entrance took a little bit longer to come along. And so then whenever you have that light penetration through the canopy, right, then you have these additional flushes of weeds. And I find grasses are really good at thriving in those those dry conditions to kind of come through. Yeah, to just kind of reflect on that and then kind of prepare for next year. In terms of another weed that I've seen a couple escapes, fields with escapes in it, and I know it's similar at the research station that we've had, is velvet leaf. And I feel like it is a combination of looking at what we sprayed and seeing that it actually only has a rating of 4 or 5 out of 9, so more suppression than actual control of that weed species. And it seems to kind of also emerge kind of towards that tail end of when the residual is actually able to be active, and so you kind of have those two things working against you, and you have a lot of just velvet leaf coming through at that timing. And then using that information to kind of make a plan for next year. So if it's resistant weeds or weeds that are known to be resistant in our area, then okay, what herbicide programs, what crops do I need to think about next year? Is the crop that I'm planning for next year, does it actually have herbicide options that are good for the weed species spectrum that I kind of have, or do I need to maybe make a switch to control those? if we're late enough in the season now, then you might think like, oh, I don't want to worry about like, or it's not worth it to like control that, like to go back in for another spray. But if it is maybe a weed species that has a really long seed bank or takes, like common ragweed, for instance, then I have some, common ragweed plants here. At the research station, we have a range where in 2015, we had dry beans. We didn't have great common ragweed control that year. And I'm not sure if that was previous to that maybe in another crop already that there was just a lot of ragweed there, or if it's specific to that situation. But we had a lot of ragweed went to seed, and still now I'll like have a whole carpet of, like this spring, a whole carpet of ragweed came up. And so because I know that, I always make sure that I plan that area of a field for either weed control trials or like I make sure that the crop there I can spray and control that ragweed. Though that being said, it is such a thick weed spread that like I did have to come in multiple times to control it so that it wouldn't go to seed. So kind of then, making sure that, okay, if we do need to switch or if we do need to use another like a herbicide technology in those crops coming up, that like we're noticing that now, taking note of that now, so that as we head towards December and ordering seed, preparing for next year, that we are well aware, and that the retailers and crop consultants and others that we work with are also aware of that this is a concern. And reaching out to them if you can't identify the weed that's in your field. I know a couple groups now have told me that they use an app called Picture This to do some ID, so that might be helpful finding resources, but also just asking and making sure that so that that weed doesn't continue to build its seed bank. This isn't going to look like much from here, but there's some baggies in here and some envelopes. Kristen Obed and Omafa. Then they do have a program where you can send in dried leaf samples, and there's, if it's something that is genetic resistance that they can have a marker for to track, then they will test that and can provide information on if it is resistant. Which if we're talking about water hemp, then there are multiple, it is resistant to multiple herbicides within Ontario, and it might not be resistant to all of those in your field. So it's good to know what it's resistant to, so that you can make a plan and know what your options are for the following year. We were also talking about it doesn't just have to be herbicides that you use for weed control either. Some growers then both fleabane and water hemp, I think part of the reason why we do see resistance in them is they're really good at adapting. They do multiple flushes per year, and they produce a lot of seed. And so whenever you have a weed that has multiple flushes per year, then it's not just the fact that of control earlier in the season, then it's also whether you're getting canopy closure, if you're getting that light interception to the soil surface and getting that seed to germinate. So in some cases, maybe you're on 30-inch beans, and maybe it's more beneficial to go to 15-inch beans. And obviously there's other factors in terms of if you have a lot of white mold or something too that you need to take into consideration, but that might be another tool that you need to consider going forward with. I've chatted with someone who had multiple flushes. They only plant 30-inch beans because that's the equipment they have access to, but they've been really frustrated at trying to control some of these weeds that have multiple flushes because of that. And so just trying to figure out, okay, what is our plan going to be for next year with that. So in terms of the plants here, then I do have some different weeds to look at. So most of these are green pigweed. I think there's a little bit of red root pigweed. mixed in there as well. Some velvet leaf. Have most of you guys seen now fleabane escapes in bean fields, especially throughout the countryside, and kind of have been able to identify it? I do know, like, we have had some fields that have been sprayed with glyphosate, with Roundup. They've looked like they've been yellowing, they look like they've been dying, and then they're still there right now, and they're starting to set seed. So just being aware of that, like checking your field a week or two after spraying, but then also checking, like, now to see if they've actually still come through. Sometimes too, you'll see with fleabane that it might burn back the center stem. Like normally you would see them as single stems like this, but sometimes it will burn back that center stem and you'll think that you've controlled it, but it will regrow from the bottom and have multiple stems. So just, again, something to kind of watch out for and be aware of if it doesn't quite look like that.
Are we not assuming that almost all fleabane glyphosate resistant now?
Yeah, so the question is, are we not assuming that most of the fleabane is glyphosate resistant? And I would say, yeah, that's a safe assumption, like in our area, like if it's in our fields. It is a common weed outside of the field too, but I'd say that even in like barnyards and stuff, like seeing more and more of it, that is probably resistant as well.
Historically, we saw that in poorly fertilized areas,
right?
Hay fields.
Yeah, and a lot of hay fields and stuff.
Never saw it in a bean field or a corn field.
Yeah, whenever I did my master's on fleabane and screened a lot of it, the susceptibles were very strongly susceptible, which is probably why we didn't see that. And then, but the resistance have like quite a range of tolerance. And so, yeah, no, you're right. I think before we didn't even think about it because it was very easily controlled in our fields. And it also like does need that light to you do see it a lot more in no-till because like surface seed. So maybe that's a combination too, that before we were tilling it under, for sure. And I know in the last group we were talking a little bit about this weed here. There's a lot of like wormwood or wild carrot sometimes too throughout fields that kind of maybe might look from a distance that it's like fleabane. So just being aware of what it actually is and what the control of it might be. Common ragweed. Yeah, there's some quite a bit of group 2 resistance to common ragweed in the province. So just being aware of that. Like I said, we do tend to see a lot of those escapes more in like IP fields and those later flushes. Similar for like in terms of just like knowing your herbicide and knowing how it works, then you can use like reflex or a contact herbicide for common ragweed. But it does have to be quite small then, right? If it's a contact herbicide to get complete control. Otherwise, actually this year I did see some plants that kind of regrew similar to the fleabane and kind of came back with multiple stems because the beans kind of took a little bit longer to get to like second trifoliate or to that threshold for when you could spray. And so trying to balance that, like controlling the weeds at the proper staging, but also wanting to make sure that there weren't later flushes of weeds, then just sometimes then they can kind of get a little bit bigger and not have this great of control. And kind of along those lines, like just starting off the year with like a really controlling the weeds well. Like Peter's research has shown, and I know we know that from other research as well, that that critical weed-free period in both corn and soybeans, early, like starting clean and allowing it to get well established, then that also means that if like we do get these really high temperatures later on and maybe can't spray the products that maybe are our options to spray later on, then they might not be an option because of temperature. So making sure that we do that weed control early in the season, and so that we're like only trying to control a few weeds versus like a big carpet of weeds and impacting yields. So trying to find the balance between all of those things. I know sometimes even at the research station, like I just really want to get certain plots in, or but learning over the years that like taking that extra hour or two to maybe like incorporate a herbicide, especially in like my dry bean plots, or even in like some of my soybean plots, if I don't get a good pre-plant or pre-emergent spray on, and sometimes I'll be like, oh, I'll plant it and then I'll get a pre-emergent spray on, and then like the weather turns, it comes up too quick for me to get that pre-emergent spray on, then like, you know, a couple weeks later, I'm back in there to do weed control. A couple weeks after that, I'm back in there to do weed control. So just like, yeah, taking the time to set yourself up so that you're not like on that time crunch, or that your options aren't limited once the weather changes. Because looking at like last year, we didn't have quite as hot of a summer, but this year, like the average temperatures the last 3 months have all been over, the highs have all been over 30. So then that kind of also limits both your weed control, but you also have some weeds that go dormant, or you won't get as good of control, or the cuticle kind of has thickened up. So yeah, looking at these plants here, I think, yeah, we talked about the Picture This app, but also I think that it's just really beneficial to get to see them in person and to like look at them. And I think the more that you kind of look at them in person, then the quicker you can like identify them. Then if you guys are welcome to kind of get up and look at this table here, should all be water hemp plants. It has a really smooth stem, kind of long skinny leaves. Maybe looks a little bit more waxy than these. This one here is really hairy, and this is red root pigweed. The green root pigweed is a little more smooth and doesn't have as much hairs, but if you do look closely, and I do have some hand lenses there too, if that's helpful for people, but especially near the top, then you can still see a lot of those hairs. So feel free to come up and look. I did also want to just say for like, yeah, the water hemp, that in terms of resistance in Ontario, then like, yeah, groups 2, group 5, group 9, group 14, and group 27 have all been reported as resistance. They don't necessarily, like I said before, I think all populations don't necessarily have all of that resistance, or they might have multiple combinations. So just kind of like good to know. Peter's going to cover some of the, he's going to go through in depth like the control of water hemp. But I think it's just a good thing to be aware of, to, you know, if you do see pigweed escapes, to also make the consideration that it could be water hemp, and just be aware of, yeah, all your different fields. So feel free to come up and look at it. One thing I will say, another group asked too about like, yeah, sometimes it can look a little bit different, and there's different like biotypes, and some of that is because it does cross-pollinate, so that means you get like a lot of genetic variation of how it looks. So again, I think it's just really beneficial to like kind of get some hands-on time to like look at it, study a little bit more, become a bit more familiar with it, because I find the more times that I see a weed, the more comfortable I get at being like confident at what it looks like.